Tara. I work with JFS, Community Engagement Coordinator. Today we have Rachel with us, and Zala will join us later. We're talking about the Afghan community and Afghan culture, and she has phenomenal knowledge. So I'll pass the ball to you, Rachel. If you want to introduce yourself and start us off.
I will. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm going to get started. Zala will be with us any moment now, so you'll get the best, I hope, of two of our heads with thoughts and experiences in and around Afghanistan. Did I already move way ahead in my presentation? Let's see. How did I get there? Not paying attention. Yeah, so we both would like to express our appreciation to the Jewish Family Services Western Mass for recognizing the need to give extra attention to the resettlement of newly arrived Afghans, and they organized a series of presentations that we've been doing, and I really appreciate you all setting aside some time for this. I hope it's worth your while. Our approach to presenting is to talk about the country of Afghanistan, the geography, the ethnicities, the religions and family structures, gender dynamics, basic health hygiene, and to focus on the volunteer-related issues as we see them. Our presentation is about 40 minutes, and you're welcome to put comments or questions in chat while we're talking, and then of course we'll open up for discussion at the end. Sometimes we get a little longer than we want it to be, and so if we don't address all questions or comments at the end, we will be meeting again next week to go into more detail about some of those issues. And we both apologize for offering a very general introduction because there are so many languages, cultures, religious practices, ethnicities, tribal structures, educational differences, social classes in Afghanistan that it's hard, of course, to generalize. Nevertheless, we're doing it to some extent, but of course, not everything will apply to all. Almost every one of the images that we're using today are ones that we own ourselves, and we're very aware of the many sensitivities that Afghans have around photographs, particularly those of women. So we're using a few images in addition by an Afghan photographer named Fatima Husseini, and her images are very beautiful. My name is, is Zala here? Because I always like her to go first, but is she here? Do you see her, Masar?
Yeah, I'm here. It's okay. You can go first.
No, you, are you just getting settled?
No, I'm here. It's fine. I'm here. I just click on the same link so I could.
Okay, good. You know what? I don't like to speak for you. You know, I'm trying to be very careful, but please introduce yourself and then I'll introduce myself then. Glad to see you're here.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. And as Rachel said, thank you for your time and interest to learn about Afghanistan and the Afghan culture that will help better build a relationship or help the Afghan evacuees settle in the United States. My name is Zala Ahmad. I'm Afghan and also American, and I live in Virginia, and I have, well, I can say that I have lived most of my life as a refugee myself, so I have like firsthand experience of all the challenges refugee face. I lived in Iran for a few years. My family, I was a kid, of course, during Russian invasion, and then Pakistan, and then for the last 12 years, I would say in the United States. Because of my passion and that I have to work for Afghanistan and Afghan women, I have always, my work has been related to Afghanistan. So I have traveled a lot back and forth between the two countries. I worked in international development for the last 15 years with a focus on women economic development and girls education. I am co-founder of a nonprofit that used to work in Afghanistan. I currently also, I co-founded a social enterprise that's still active in Afghanistan, creating jobs for women. And I'm a Fulbright scholar. I have my master's in international economics and finance and a bachelor degree in social development studies. And I have, of course, worked with Rachel on a few research studies on issues of women leadership in Afghanistan as well, in partnership with the University of Colorado. And with the recent Afghan evacuees, I also worked with them for 2 months at Fort Dix base in New Jersey.
Thank you, Sala. So you're getting a really full package. And my name's Rachel Lair. I have to say my career has been formulated and colored by Afghanistan and its surroundings. I took up Persian in college for no good reason. I shouldn't say that, for no other reason than it fit in my schedule. And later learned the dialects spoken in Iran, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan. And I went on to pursue language and linguistics for my PhD, and I studied in Iran before the revolution, traveled to Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion, and was awarded a Fulbright in Soviet Tajikistan, where I spent about a year. I ended up actually writing a grammar of a minority language in Afghanistan called Pashai, and I understand there are some Pashai speaking people in the Springfield general area. It's a small minority language of rural people in the Eastern Mountains. I also co-founded a nonprofit called Rubia with women in Afghanistan as an income generation project. And during the Obama years, during his civilian surge in the mid-2000s, I worked doing cultural training for the US government in various capacities. So Zala mentioned that we worked together on research grants on Afghan women's leadership and authority at multiple scales through University of Colorado. So I have to say I have a very varied background, and I also have learned my lessons the hard way. So I have definitely made every intercultural mistake one could make. I have inadvertently insulted people, and a lot of wrong choices, but Afghans were particularly kind and guided me towards better choices and better words. And so I bring you that, learning the hard way. As a linguist, I always like to start with a little bit of language. So the most ubiquitous greeting is Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. And the response is to switch the words around, wa alaikum assalam, and upon you, peace. And Afghans respond very well to you picking up a little bit of their language, a few greetings and things like that. People really appreciate that. So I always encourage people to give it a try.
Salam alaikum.
Afghanistan is a country that sits at the crossroads of the Silk Road. Between East and West, and many major cultures have influenced it. I like to think of Afghanistan as more defined by where it's not than where it is geographically. So Afghanistan is not the Middle East, it's not Central Asia, and it's not South Asia. It's kind of bits and pieces of all of those places. The population of Afghanistan is 37.5 million, and the capital city of Kabul is 4.5 million, which is kind of staggering, actually. Afghanistan is a place that always confuses its invaders, its guests, its occupiers. Nobody can quite figure it out, and that is really quite damning. But it is also the home of Rumi, the poet, and the game of polo and backgammon. And it's often described as rough and rugged and unconquerable. But if you look at a few pictures of Afghanistan, you'll see it's breathtakingly beautiful as well. The cultures of Afghanistan have been influenced over the years by Buddhist monks who traveled through from the east, the raiding hordes of Turkic tribes from the north, the indigenous Indo-European and Indo-Aryan cultures, and Islam, of course, which has profoundly and repeatedly continued to transform Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and there's scant water, so all the rivers run through it. The Hindu Kush Mountains divide the country from northeast to southwest. There's a desert in the south and steppe in the north, and many of the recent arrivals are from the southeastern part of the country. The climate is arid. It's rarely below 20 degrees. In the summer, it can be hot and humid in the east, kind of like how it feels right now in New York, where I'm sitting, and dry in Kabul because of the altitude of nearly 6,000 feet. Afghanistan is more than 70% rural, and most of the people are subsistence farmers. It takes the work of a lot of family members to make ends meet. Drought has been a persistent problem in Afghanistan for years, and there's far more arable land than there is water to cultivate. Water rights and land ownership are continuous sources of tension and conflict. There is a saying in Afghanistan that Kabul can be without gold, but not without snow, meaning that snow bodes well for the upcoming agricultural season. Nevertheless, the Northeast winter is longer and harsher than what most Afghans are accustomed to. Child labor is common. In the city, children are often sent out to sell products on the street or to run shops. In the countryside, they do agricultural work. So in urban areas, you might find children working in mechanic shops or at convenience stores or selling items wherever when you think they should be in school, but they're not. I'm going to give you a quick, very brief history of Afghanistan. It was never colonized by the British, though 3 wars were fought over their attempts. This ability to deflect the British from their country has always been a continuous source of pride among Afghans. The borders were determined during the late 19th century, where Russian and British colonial powers were vying for territory, influence, and wealth and resources. They battled what was known as the Great Game, and Afghanistan was conquered by neither, but the borders were defined as a buffer zone between those 2 large empires. Political conflict in the 1970s led to the Soviet invasion in 1979, which drove over 3 million Afghan refugees into Pakistan and gave rise to numerous Mujahideen factions that were bolstered in Pakistan and funded by the US. The US proxy war ended with the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, and the US interest in Afghanistan evaporated along with it. Civil war raged among the Mujahideen factions until 1996, when the Taliban movement rose in response. Their Islamic emirate came out of the Islamic schools, the madrasas that were educating Afghan youth in Pakistan. They put an end to civil war, but created a pariah state, plunging the country deeper into poverty and isolation. This all ostensibly ended with the US invasion in 2001. As a linguist, I love ethno-linguistic maps, so I'll give you a quick run through this map as well. Afghanistan has so many ethnicities. If you just look at the different colors on this map, you see the major language groups of tribally and non-tribally organized people. Languages come from multiple different sources. They're not all related to each other. None of the Afghan languages are related genetically to Arabic. And that's important because people confuse that sometimes. Even though they share the same script, it's a modified script, they're not related languages. So the dominant group, as you can see in green, is the Pashtuns, and they are the largest ethnic group. They speak the language called Pashto. You've probably heard that the Taliban are predominantly Pashtun, but it's also true that the monarchs and the elected presidents were Pashtun as well. Pashtuns are, for the most part, Sunni Muslim, and you can find them all over Afghanistan. You can also see that a good portion of Pakistan is Pashtun as well. And so alliances across borders are quite important. And you can see with all the languages that these languages are found on both sides of the borders. And that tells us something about pressures and allegiances. The next in population would be the Dari speaking. I think that's listed here as Tajik on this map, and those the purples and the blues. And the language is called Persian, Farsi, Tajik, Dari in Afghanistan. And they also live throughout Afghanistan, and they are mostly Sunni Muslim. That kind of purplish area in the center is where the Hazara people live. They make up about 9–10% of the population. And they speak Hazaragi, or also Afghan Dari. It's a dialect of Dari. They've been seen as the most marginalized group and persecuted for a long time. They're mostly practiced Shia Islam. And because of that, they've suffered persecutions and genocides. Many fled to Iran during the past 40 years of conflict, and quite a few migrated at the turn of the 20th century to Pakistan, to Quetta. And so many of them are Pakistani now. In the north, there are Uzbek and Turkmen and Kyrgyz and other languages all over. What's important is that in a place where there are so many limited resources and competition is fierce, everything is a zero-sum game. There's only one winner and everybody else is a loser in a lot of ways. So the kinds of prejudices and rivalries between families, tribes, and ethnicities are not left behind in Afghanistan. They bring them to the diaspora, of course. I just have two oppositions here. One is an Afghan and one's an Afghani. Though some people like to, so the currency is Afghani. Some people, it's kind of current to refer to people from Afghanistan as Afghanistani, but I don't want to get into the politics of that because that's a political issue for some. Just mention it. Afghan society is steeped in Islam, and it is a central organizing principle in most Afghans' lives. The one thing that is common to all Afghans is their commitment to Islam as both a belief system and as a social program. The idea being that a unity of belief is linked to collective well-being, resulting in social order, and Islam brings a strong sense of morality. So Sunni Muslims, as I said, make up 90% of the population, and Shia Muslims are about 10%, although both follow the teachings of the religious texts of the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and the 5 pillars of Islam, which are prayer, charity, the fast of the month of Ramadan, Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, and the declaration of Shahada, or the profession of faith. So the virgin birth of Jesus is upheld in Islam, and Jesus is considered the penultimate prophet in Islam. Mentioned throughout the Quran, as is Mary, Maryam is also revered. So Islam pervades all aspects of lives. People quote the sayings, they pray or not. It's their choice multiple times a day. The clothing that people wear is Islamically informed. It's meant to be loose-fitting and modest. And Islam also informs what is halal, that is permitted, and what is haram, which is that which is not permitted. And that may refer to marriage partners, it'll refer to food, it'll refer to all kinds of behaviors. So the simple on the food is no pork, no alcohol. And that's a very big concern for a lot of Afghans here, that some pork or some alcohol or something they're not supposed to have might get slipped into their food somehow. Mosque attendance is mostly a male activity in Afghanistan, not especially among the Sunnis, not so much among the Shia. We've just recently had Ramadan that ended at the beginning of May, and the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, so the dates don't line up with our calendar. And also the Afghans have a solar calendar, which just makes things even more complicated. But Ramadan is a month of spiritual reflection and fasting from sunup to sundown. Families get up before sunrise to have their meal, and they don't take food or water until the evening breakfast called iftar. It's celebratory and a time for visiting friends and relatives. The month of Ramadan ends with Eid al-Fitr, the festival of the breakfast, and it's appropriate to give gift baskets of sweets and candies at this time and to say Eid Mubarak. Children often receive some cash and candies and things like that. Birthdays are not so much celebrated, certainly customarily not at all in Afghanistan. More recently they are, but since births were not always recorded, officially Afghans often estimate their age and set their own birth dates. And apparently January 1st is a very popular one. Other core concepts that are organizing principles in Afghanistan, in Afghan society, include honor, family, and gender roles. So Afghan communities, the villages and the rural regions, tend to be self-governing. There has never been much reach of the government into the rural regions, and the government is seen as corrupt and greedy and unreliable and unavailable. So these are some of the areas where Afghans will continue to be suspicious here in the US until they see the government in a different way in the US. So lack of services from the central government is not this way, and suspicion runs high of government representation. That's therefore, I should say, Afghans prefer to avoid authorities and manage their affairs themselves. And developing trust and positive relationships is going to take a long time. And I would say developing trust with volunteers may take a while as well, until people are, sure that these people don't want to hurt them or report them or anything else, because lifestyles are quite different. Much social behavior is influenced by Afghans' awareness of their personal honor. And honor refers to a person's reputation, their prestige, their value, how they are perceived by their community. A person's reputation precedes them in all things. And I like to think of it as a wheelbarrow. So generations of families are riding up front of the wheelbarrow, and a person who's pushing it is responsible for all of the piety and honor and wealth and charity and humility of their predecessors and their family. So an individual is carrying a lot when they go out into the world. It's not just themselves. And this is a big difference between how our society is organized and how Afghan society is organized. And I can't overstate how important this is. This really is the center of the core of what matters in many ways to Afghans. So most Afghans consider a person's behavior to be reflective of the family. Thus, when a person's behavior is dishonorable, their family shares the shame. And if it occurs in the wider group, it could be the tribe or the ethnicity that shares the shame. And people tend to behave conservatively because they want to avoid drawing attention to themselves or risk doing something that might be perceived as dishonorable. The senior male member of the family is responsible to protect the honor and well-being of the family, particularly as it concerns the behavior of women around dress, social interaction, education, work, and public presence. And it could be seen as a loss of honor to the father, the brother, the husband, if a woman does not comply with these expectations. And it can cause a lot of friction. And that's one of the things that can cause a lot of friction here when women are encouraged to go out more. And so some of these tensions carry into students in school as well. With respect to the family, the core notion is of private versus public. So private is both a physical and a social space, and family matters, all family matters are part of the private sphere. You can kind of picture it as all family matters behind that big wall that goes around the whole compound here. And an Afghan home in the countryside in particular is a fortress surrounded by high mud brick walls. The social space faces the inner courtyard, and the outside walls have no windows. So even in the diaspora, people don't like to have their windows open. They always have them covered. And multiple generations might be living in this compound and sharing the cooking and the cleaning and the maintenance of the space, usually related, sharing land and stuff. There's not a great sense of privacy among Afghans or private space in an Afghan household. And by the same token, social isolation is considered severe punishment. And so the notion of time out might be considered cruel. In urban areas, this is a picture from Kabul, the space is limited and people live in small compounds, like you see here, or in apartment buildings as well. Women's sphere is in the home. So women are in charge of the domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, raising children, preparing food for guests. And here too, there's a hierarchy. So the mother is at the top, delegating tasks to her daughters and granddaughters, or I should say, and her daughters-in-law. And the newest bride is usually the lowest in the pecking order, because sons bring their wives home to live in their family compounds for the most part. So the wife of the oldest son is the next highest in the pecking order. The wife of the youngest son is usually trying to figure out how to separate their household so she gets some authority eventually. And the girls are in charge of the household tasks of cleaning and washing up and helping out, cooking and things like that. And that occupies them a great deal, particularly in the countryside, I should say. And I should stop and say, I forget sometimes to say, my experience is much deeper in the countryside in Afghanistan. And even in the times when I was living in Kabul, I lived with people who were country people living in Kabul. So their experience is very country. Luckily, Zala has much more urban experience. And so we speak to sort of both sides of Afghanistan. Laundry is a big deal for Afghan women. It's usually done by hand, and women prefer to do it themselves at home. It's a point of privacy and a point of pride to do their family's laundry and the laundry of their guests. So when you come to an Afghan's house and stay overnight, your clothes get washed automatically, usually. Laundromats are not a comfortable thing for, people often travel just in the clothes they have, maybe one change of clothing. Laundromats are not a comfortable place for Afghans, and small portable washers make great gifts. And I've been told about these little washers that you can plug into your kitchen sink or bathroom sink that a whole family can do their laundry on that don't cost very much. So other Afghans have been telling me to encourage people if they want to give them something, that would be a thing. Afghans don't typically change their clothes very often, particularly in Afghanistan, because there's not a lot of resources there's not a lot of water, and there's not a lot of resources for keeping personal hygiene at the kind of level that we're used to here. People don't change into pajamas to go to sleep. They'll sleep in their clothes. And where water is scarce, and the cost of heating the water, which might be fuel, would be some kind of fuel that's costly, keeps people very careful with their resources. In some areas, pregnant women believe it's bad for the baby if they wash up at all. So people will go long periods without washing up if that's the case, when that is the case. But as you can see, conditions are quite different in urban Afghanistan. And this is Zala sitting in the back of this picture at a dinner in Kabul. So you can see that it's quite different from the countryside that I've been showing you. The evacuees that we have here have come from both settings, but most of them that I think you're dealing with in your area are rural folk is what I've been told. And even though there's much less housework for the young women to do in the city, there's more opportunities for girls to go to school because they're not tasked with all the housework. There's still plenty to keep them busy. Babies, and there are lots of them. Large families are typically swaddled for most of their first year. This black powder called kohl or surma is rubbed into their eyes, and they say it makes them look attractive. Some women have said they think it's good for them. Some people here think it has lead in it and it's not so good for them. In any case, that's a typical practice in Afghanistan. And they also believe that they tie the babies quite tight into this swaddle, and that they believe that this will help them grow long and tall and strong, so that they think it's good for their bodies. Women are generally valued by the number of sons they produce. And so Afghan families can be large, 6 to 10, 12 kids. Most women in the countryside give birth alone, rarely in hospitals, rarely with midwives, although there has been more in the last number of years, but still many by themselves. And so maternal and infant mortality has been quite high in Afghanistan for a long time. Few women have ever had access to prenatal care before in Afghanistan, especially in the countryside. Urban might be different. And so many will have experienced it here in the US on the bases for the first time. Men's role is chiefly outside the home. So the public sphere, they're responsible for the economic well-being of a family. And that's the men often who are out doing the shopping for a family and picking up items that are needed. And certainly in the countryside, some women do embroidery or cheese making or other things to earn a little money on the side, and all of it helps. In the urban areas, women have more opportunities to work outside the home. to support their families, such as the work that Zala's enterprise does in Kabul right now, hiring women to do sewing. And that really, some of these women are the entire supporters of their families. The family structure is quite traditional, patriarchal, and most of the decisions are taken by the father or the husband, and an age hierarchy applies there too, with the oldest son having much of the decision-making power. Of course, a lot of this is in flux, especially among the urban Afghans, but not so much in the countryside. And many of the rural Afghans I know who have emigrated to the US or European cities follow this pattern as well. So the women are expected to stay home. They're expected to do all the household chores, and it can take years of resettlement before women can learn the local language, get a job, learn to drive. Those are really important milestones and can take a long time till they get to do those things. Pastimes in Afghanistan are mostly very social, such as visiting families and friends, where stories and gossip are shared widely, and dried fruit and nuts. As you can see here, this is quite a spread. With green tea with some cardamom in it are standard fare when Afghans get together. It's the minimal gesture of hospitality. So Afghans, if you're invited to an Afghan's house and they offer you tea, you should take the tea, and you don't have to drink it if you don't want to, but you certainly should accept that hospitality, because it would be an insult to refuse. And I've been in situations where tea wasn't offered and then the Afghans were insulted. So you just never know. It's complicated, I should say. Pets in Afghanistan, birds are popular pets. Afghans don't keep dogs or cats for the most part. Dogs are considered particularly dirty. They are kept as guard dogs mostly. I've seen dogs abused quite a bit in Afghanistan. They use them for fighting in certain circles. And so when Afghans come to your house and you have a dog there, I'd say put it away, because Afghans will be very polite and say, no, no, it's okay, but they really don't like them and tend to be afraid of them. And it's best to just put them out of the way. And yeah. Children show great deference and respect to their elders. Even when they're grown up, they expect their parents have enough wisdom to know what's best for them, and they trust them to make important decisions in their lives. This extends often to marriage partners, and most marriages are arranged by parents. Not all, of course, but arranging marriages, celebrating engagements, entertaining guests are hugely important to Afghans. In some cases, parents engage their babies to each other to solidify bonds, often first cousin marriage, not always, but often first cousin or within family marriages or second cousins, things like that, to solidify bonds and strengthen families. Some cases they will marry their children to each other to strengthen an alliance or even a conflict. But there are also people who choose their own partners in Afghanistan. That's much more common with educated urban people than it is with the people in the countryside. There's a considerable range of attitudes that Afghans have towards education in rural areas. There's widespread reserve about education, and I know many, especially for girls, and many of the families who are here the men haven't been educated, the women haven't been educated, the children have not experienced school, even in areas where even in some areas in rural Afghanistan, girls might go to school till 4th grade. So there's not much beyond that for a lot of the girls. And the education is much more limited by comparison to what we have in the US. Lack of literacy is commonplace and not shameful in Afghanistan. And it's not mandatory. So whether you go to school or not is kind of a family choice or a personal choice. So I know that adjustment to English in schools is going to take a long time, and it's a big issue. And for students with families with non-literate parents, the challenge of educational compliance and investment is going to take time too, because typically Afghans don't meddle in what's going on at school. Kids are on their own with their school stuff and parents are not involved, and that's quite different from here. Schools in Afghanistan are for the most part gender segregated, so that's also a bit of a challenge for people here who are not used to having coeducation in school. Corporal punishment is still used in Afghanistan in schools, and actually they can be pretty rough at home as well. That's part of the culture. So some of the most basic skills like learning to ask questions or take turns or line up can be challenging. And also teachers, whether you're teaching an ESL class or students or helping students in school, they might be very shy or reluctant to raise their hands or share their concerns or even ask a question. They might be embarrassed not to know the answer. It's not good not to know the answer in Afghanistan. And so other students might think poorly of them, or they might be afraid that others will think poorly of them if they ask a question. And so these are really very pressing, important issues for them. They don't want to be judged by others. After school activities and sleepovers, for example, not likely, especially for girls. Teenage girls may already be engaged and dating is forbidden. So the kind of socialization that happens outside school or within school may be off limits to some of these Afghan students and make it that much harder for them. Many changes have happened in Afghanistan over the past 20 years of US and coalition involvement. And those changes apply less in rural areas. I think you're getting my point about that, especially regarding some of the evacuees. During the previous Taliban regime, which was 1996 to 2001, women and girls were subjected to strict dress codes, excluded from work outside the home, denied access to education and healthcare, and had limited mobility. That's starting to happen again in Afghanistan, but I think that it will be hard to make it apply as broadly, having had a generation of girls educated. But it's a conservative society, and women in general should not be seen by men. They're meant to be covered and not exposed to men outside their household. That's the Afghan custom, and it's distressing for the men and the women to be seen sometimes by men outside their household. Usually an Afghan woman is accompanied when she goes in public by a mahram. That's like a male escort. It might be a son, it might be a brother, somebody like that who she's allowed to be seen by. Now, women have fought hard to gain legitimacy and authority in public decision-making in Afghanistan, but many are still obedient to their fathers and their brothers and their husbands. And so women in school may often not speak before men do and not speak in the presence of men. And that's just the way they've been raised. Certainly not true across the board. I've spoken to many accomplished women and leaders. Zala and I have conducted lots of interviews together over the years of ministers and business leaders and activists, and they always emphasize how important their father's role was in making sure they were educated. And they point this out as the exception, not the rule. So Zala was lucky to have the father she does, to get where she got to go, where she is now. Socialization outside the immediate family tends to be gender segregated. Men socialize with men and women with women. And of course, this doesn't apply across the board. There's certainly urban and educated Afghans who socialize publicly in formal mixed settings, but not generally. Men hold men's hands. It's a sign of friendship, and women are affectionate with women. My recommendation is to not touch somebody across gender. I think we know better than to do that in general, but in particular in Afghanistan, it's often if a man doesn't look at a woman or he averts his gaze or doesn't shake her hand, it's often a sign of respect, not disrespect. It's very hard for us to read that as respect, but that's how it's meant as opposed to disrespect. And so I just generally tell people, don't put your hand out first. I don't know if anybody shakes hands anymore since COVID. I certainly don't. But if, wait till somebody puts their hand out before you shake it so that you know if they're comfortable shaking your hand or not. If you're alone with an Afghan cross-gender, or even in general, best to leave the door open. Should not be behind closed doors, because that could be, people are going to wonder or gossip about what might have possibly happened behind closed doors. So I wanted to say a few things about communication in general, because our communication strategies are quite different. I heard, it was a line on a TV show recently I heard where somebody said, Some things need to be said and some things need to be understood. And I think that really encapsulates the difference between our modes of communication. So here in the US, we're very explicit. Things need to be said to be communicated. That's where our focus is. We don't expect people to understand by implication. Our style is very direct. That would be considered a low context. You don't expect people to know what you're talking about. But by contrast, in Afghanistan, it's a high context society. So meaning is embedded in sociocultural context and much more is communicated implicitly. So it's much more focused on those things which need to be understood, not necessarily what's said. People speak through analogies, they tell stories, and they use implication to communicate. And so part of this ties in with honor, and that if you're speaking indirectly or you expect to be spoken to indirectly, then you can always protect the dignity and honor of your interlocutor and avoid conflict in that way. So it's hard often to admit you don't have the right answer because you didn't understand something. It might be a loss of honor. It might be hard for Afghans to ask for assistance, even though they need it, especially in front of other Afghans. They don't want to show weakness. I certainly had this experience teaching in Kabul where if I threw a question out to the room, making sure people understood, they would just nod their heads. And then afterwards, after class, each person came up to me individually with their question. They couldn't ask it in front of others. So in the same way, if you ask someone, do you know what I'm talking about? Or do you get it? It would be embarrassing for them to say no. And so chances are they'll say yes. And then you might want to triangulate around making sure that they understood what you were talking about. And it's also hard for Afghans to say no because it's really a social no-no to disappoint someone. So saying no is very hard. Somebody might say yes, but they don't mean, yes, I'm actually going to do that. So declining an offer or an invitation is Afghan etiquette. So from a very young age, Afghans learn this convention. I was sitting with a group of children eating my favorite candy, M&Ms, and I offered it to them and they all said no, because that's politeness to say no. And I didn't understand that they were being polite. And so I ate my M&Ms and they had to watch me eat my candy when I should have placed one in each person's hand, in each child's hand. So I was so rude and they were so polite. And several Afghan women have told me this story of their first few days with a host family when they were asked if they wanted something to eat. Naturally, they would say no, or no, thank you, or decline. And many were not served food, of course, because in America, if somebody says they don't want to eat, you don't put food in front of them. And several of them told me how it was several days of being hungry before they kind of got the lay of the land. Afghans are incredibly gracious. It's not their custom to say thank you all the time for every little thing. When they do, it's because they've picked it up from us, but they might say in their language, you know, may you live a long life, or may God go with you. But so being a good listener, I think, is one of the really important things in communication with Afghans. There's also this great expression that someone once said, which is that Afghans have watches. I take it back. Let me start again. Americans have watches. Afghans have time. And this applies to a lot of things. Partly it has to do with the different structures of our societies. So our society is highly commodified and monetized, and punctuality matters, and time is money, and it's not a shared notion in Afghanistan. So time is viewed more flexibly. Bedtimes, not such a big thing. Parent-teacher meetings, doctor appointments, getting to school on time, excused absences, keeping track of your records and things like that. Those are and continue to be big challenges for Afghan resettlement. As we near the end of this talk, I just wanted to say a few things about domestic life that you might find relevant. So Afghans are used to eating fresh food. Most village homes don't have refrigerators, and even in urban areas, electricity is not that reliable. And so food refrigeration is not something you can depend on. Bread is baked fresh every day in the tandoor oven. That's the mainstay of the diet. And rice, chicken, communal bowls people share from, or here, as you see this beautiful arrangement placed on their plates. Afghans tend to sit with a tablecloth on the floor. Not always, they sit at tables as well, as you've seen in some of the images. So this is traditional, and a lot of people like to do it this way. And hospitality is really important to Afghans. They take a lot of pride in hosting guests. So you may find that you're invited to dinner. Often they won't prepare it until you come. So it's a long visit and leisurely, and you can enjoy, quite a bit of time. So if you're invited to dinner, I would say, doesn't mean that they really mean for you to stay right then and there to dinner. So just as I said earlier about declining an offer, you could do the same thing. No, thank you, not now, next time maybe. And you'll get a sense from people whether they really meant for you to stay now or whether they meant they were just being polite. So it's a little bit different from here. People don't take out very much, although pizza is very popular. And of course, people are very worried about being served pork products or alcohol in something. So of course, if they're in control of the food, they're much more comfortable than, say, coming to your house and then being afraid that you might have, inadvertently or on purpose slipped something in that they're not supposed to eat, that they don't want to be caught eating. Sounds like an Afghan house here. Can you hear my grandchildren screaming in the background? I've locked the door, but still. So preventative medical care, dental care, eye care, exercise, heart healthy eating, mindfulness, attention to mental health and stress, all new ideas, and they will take a long time till people see the advantage of attending to these things. These are not things that Afghans tend to attend to. More often they go to the emergency room when they have a problem, but they don't see how it's building into something serious. Afghans have a very strong sense of fashion and style preferences, and used clothing is not a popular choice among Afghans. It's a little, it's accepting charity in a way that people might not feel comfortable with. A friend of mine was a recipient of lots of people's used winter coats because I live in New Hampshire, even though I'm in New York right now. It's very cold up there, and everybody was worried that she was not going to be warm enough. So everybody wanted to give her their old coats. And she was quite insulted, actually, that people should think that she would want their old coats. And she ended up having her mother send her coat from Kabul because that's what she wanted to wear. Whether a woman wears a headscarf or not, whether it is a personal choice, it's a family decision, and it can become contentious in school with respect to bullying and other issues. So some kids don't want to wear their scarf, even though they do at home, because they feel ostracized at school. Those who want to might feel it's problematic in other ways. So all of these could be issues especially for the youth. So I have a quick summary, and then we will still have a little time. Family is the most important thing, right? Family is everything. Protecting dignity and honor. Our communication style is tied to protecting dignity and honor and showing respect. Gender roles are very clearly circumscribed, and everybody knows, all Afghans know what the rules are pretty much. Hospitality, politeness, modesty are seen very highly, and people judge each other along those parameters. Time orientation is quite different, and people don't take other people. They may not attend to appointments or punctuality in a way that we're used to. Deadlines also are not necessarily important in Afghanistan. And trauma, of course, it goes without saying that 45 years of war and broken promises, displacement, weak government, untrustworthy authorities have taken a toll. Trauma contributes to so many of the personal and social problems that Afghans experience. They're not in a position at this point to address the notions of trauma directly. So these people who are here are so deeply indebted, and that might be tough for some of them. They are receiving charity, which makes some of them feel weak, even though they were self-sufficient at home. Many of them highly educated and working in important positions of respect and authority. And we may not recognize that here, even among the rural Afghans who had standing in their community and who did not. So I say the demands of this strange culture, the homesickness, the displacement, the anxieties about the future, the separation from their families at home weigh very heavily on everyone. And they're even though they're physically distant from their relatives in Afghanistan, communication is constant. There seems to be no problem with WhatsApp and internet and all those things that keep people in constant communication. But sometimes attention to people here with a photograph in the newspaper or something will find its way back home and may put a family member at risk. So people are particularly careful about those things. So I'm going to stop here because I think we've touched on a lot of different things. And if we have questions or people want to talk about any of it, we can open it up for discussion. I'll stop sharing now.
So we have 10 minutes for questions. We can take a couple, and then next week we have another whole hour for all the questions. So whoever wants to start.
I see there's some things in the chat. Are you looking at it, Masara?
I think Zala was answering the questions. But
Oh, good. That's great. Answering them along the way.
Managing the chat. But Mary sent a question. Do people get divorced? Is that allowed?
I'll let Zala answer.
Yeah, I just replied that it's by law. Afghanistan law, it is allowed. It's not something that would say that women cannot take divorce, but culturally speaking or socially speaking, it's a taboo. So not really, it's not something that's common in Afghanistan at all, especially in rural areas. Except that, yes, I know of cases that, and even in rural areas, that where the women was like really, like there was violence, domestic violence, and the brother or the father, they just took the divorce for their daughter or sister, but it's not common. Less than maybe 0.5% of women might take divorce in Afghanistan. Recently in urban areas, yes, it hasn't become a common thing. Still, it's a taboo, but yes, there are like cases where women take divorce. And there are lots of issues. It's not just that it's a taboo, there's no support, institutional support for it. Even if a woman come forward and say, oh, I want to take divorce and go to the court, even the court, those established structure, they don't support her. They try to send her back to the husband's family or to the husband, and that makes the situation even far worse if it's domestic violence or anything. And the other big issue is the children in Afghanistan. According to the law, the children go to the father. So that's something that women don't want to take divorce, even if they wish to. The other issue is, of course, economic reasons, that they're very dependent on the husband.
Well, it's also the case that some of those women who want divorce, they come to the West. They will seek divorce here more often than they would in Afghanistan, because they might find it a little bit more supportive of them outside of Afghanistan. But it's not just this, it's the family that pushes very hard against it. All families don't live together, right? So husbands might live separate from their wives. They might take a second wife. They don't have to divorce the first one to take the second one. So those are issues as well, right? One of my friends who's divorced, and she's a researcher in Afghanistan, she said, and this applies for Afghanistan and not for the question that was asked here about being divorced and disapproval. She said she told everybody she was a widow and that nobody minded. Whereas if she told people in Afghanistan that she was divorced, that people would have looked down on her. So it is an uncomfortable thing.
Yeah, they will definitely blame the women, because culturally speaking, again, they want the women to be more kind of compromise with everything, or especially if a woman has children, they how come you are not a good mother, that you left your children. Yeah.
Now there was a question about cousin marriage, and it's probably a long answer, but cousin marriage is very popular, and for a number of reasons. It's for economic reasons, for security reasons. Afghans are particularly distrustful in general. And so you could really only trust people who you have leverage over or who are within your family. So even to protect your daughters, marrying them within the family is preferred. Would you add anything else to that, Sala?
Yeah, I also replied. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
as you
Okay.
said, it's very common, and for these reasons, and that they marry among cousins or second cousins, first cousins. It's very common, and also it has to do with the mobility and all these issues in rural areas, because that's who they know. Like they're in this village, they don't want to. They just do intermarriages within the village, which are often relatives as well.
Yeah, they want to keep them, that way they can keep their daughters closer to home as well and have back and forth. I can't remember in English how you say that, between the households is very important.
Yeah, I see Rich and I see Al. Rich, go ahead.
We have an Afghan family of 6 children, obviously 2 adults, and we have a swimming pool, and we look forward to having them all come and swim in the pool in this hot weather. But I was wondering what the modesty issues might be that we should be aware of. Generally, women wear bathing suits that are different than hijab, and are there any concerns that we should have?
I'll start the answer and I'll let Zala address it more, but they don't have swimming pools in Afghanistan, and most Afghans don't swim and aren't safe in the water and are kind of afraid of water and stuff. So it's not at all part of their custom, although it is lovely to cool off in hot weather. But you wouldn't, unless you have a group family. I'll let Zala address the details of that. Go ahead, Zala.
Yeah, swimming pool, yeah, definitely. Just to add on that, so as Rachel in the beginning said, whatever we say, it's more like general, like information. It's really, really different for it's case by case. I would say there are families in Afghanistan that are really way modern than we may not be in US, but we are talking about the 80% of Afghans here, not the 5%. So it really depends on who the family is. That's one thing that I would say, we want to know, they have been living in the urban, in the city in Afghanistan. They are educated, their parents are educated, and all. That's one issue to look at it. There have been swimming pools recently in Kabul. I know my own relatives, women, 50 something, that they were going, they had classes in Kabul, so they would go to the swimming pool, but that's again in Kabul or Herat, in these urban centers in Afghanistan.
Like gender separated or mixed gender?
No, not mixed. Of course, it was not mixed, except Serena Hotel, which it's very 5-star, 7-star. But I would say if they have kids, kids always enjoy it. They would not have an issue for the kids if they're 9 or 10 or 8 years old. So you may want to tell them to have swimming clothes, right? If they don't have, so just to get that.
To teach them water safety.
But for adults, I don't know. For adults, they may not know swimming because mostly there's no swimming pool, so they don't know swimming. I learned swimming 3 years ago here, so and but I was not going to any swimming pool in Afghanistan. There were a few, but I decided not to go because of all those reasons, culturally and socially, it was not.
Normal swimwear, is that something that they would be embarrassed to have someone be wearing? The host family, my wife wearing a normal bathing suit?
That could, I took one of my Afghan friends to the beach in New Hampshire a few years ago, and she she wanted her picture. She was dressed, fully dressed, and she said she wanted her picture taken with all those naked people behind her. So it was quite shocking and disturbing to her. And she was happy to get wet even in the ocean in her clothing. So yeah, I think you might be expecting a lot. We don't know who that family is, but yeah. And actually, it might be shocking for them to see your wife in her bathing suit. That who knows?
Yeah, if it's just the wife coming, like
Just
if
the
it's
women.
the female, that's fine, absolutely. But if it's also the husband,
Yeah,
so I mean, probably I would say for your wife it should be okay, but like for him, he might be embarrassed,
he'll
right?
be embarrassed. Yeah, he'll be
Kind of
embarrassed.
like that. I mean, if
Yeah.
just the female, like the mother with the kids, that should be fine. In that case, then it might be embarrassing if you would come with the, I mean, I'm just saying, like it's all
Right.
like, so it's not like just one thing, but if I would know the family, like it's really important, like what's the context of that family.
Yeah, I know there was one other question, although we're out of time. Is it a quick one?
No, it's a lot more about gender roles and how to support the families here and kids and the relationships, because that's been coming up in the community at large, seeing some of the sexism playing out. And so, but I can wait for that for.
Will you come next week when we, okay, great, because I think it's great for us to talk about that. And Zala and I will talk about it together too, because it's very challenging to see some of the stuff that you see and not know, how to guide people in the gentlest ways or, yeah, yep, yep. Thank you all. Thank you for great questions here.
Thank you so much for coming. I'll be sending out the calendar invite on Friday. Thank you, Zala. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Masara, for organizing this.
Sure.
So it's still recording. Masara, are you in charge of the recording